A lot of people have this idea that spirituality is all love and light, blissfulness and peacefulness, but actually there's a great deal of suffering involved. And I think a lot of people aren't really prepared for that. Maybe it has to do with the way that it's marketed, because if people went around trying to sell you on spirituality, saying that you're going to be facing a lot of suffering, that you're going to be going through some really intense emotional shit, most people would probably run the other way. And so a lot of people turn to spirituality as a place to escape from their suffering. And there are ways of doing that, all temporary, of course, because most of that is just about distracting or deluding yourself, and you can only do that for so long. Eventually, you have to face it. Eventually, you'll be forced to face it. And if you aren't open to that, it's actually going to be much more painful. So it's not about escaping from suffering. Mostly it's about learning to face your suffering and to grow through it. And when you're open to it like that, it actually makes it much easier to deal with. Or as Thich Nhat Hanh would often say, if you know how to suffer, you suffer much less. And I've tried it both ways, and I can attest to the fact that resisting our suffering, repressing it, denying it, trying to cover it up and refusing to look at it only works for so long. When we bottle up our emotions, what tends to happen is that it all builds up inside of us until there's just no room left to contain it. And at that point, it all comes spilling out. And not only is it intense just by the fact that there's so much all coming up at once, but what makes it worse is that we've gotten so accustomed to resisting it, so that when it finally does surface, we're not prepared. There's still that resistance to looking at it, and it just makes it all the more unbearable. But the reverse of this is that if we're willing to work with our suffering as it shows up, each time it shows up in the moment, then it's incremental and therefore much more manageable. And it doesn't tend to pile up over time. In fact, it tends to decrease over time. As we work through it, we gradually get free of it, but that requires the willingness to really look at it and find out where it's arising from. And so in many ways, spirituality is really offering us the tools to deal with our suffering, not to avoid it, but to process it in a healthy way. However, as I said, if we do avoid it, it will eventually show back up. We will have to face it at some point, and if we're not willing to do that, we just wind up making it a lot more difficult than it has to be. So having approached suffering in both ways, I've learned that it's much better to just face it. And I've spent many years of my life working through a lot of suffering, overcoming many attachments and illusions and the like. But there have also been some things which I've still tended to overlook or avoid or repress or ignore. As much as I've spent the time working through a lot of that, I'm often finding that there's always more, something else which I may have missed. So even though I may be doing some work in one area, there may be some other area that I'm neglecting, intentionally or unintentionally, perhaps unwilling to even acknowledge, or maybe I just put that aside and never get around to facing it, and over time eventually I just forget about it. So even with the intention to work through my suffering, there have still been things which I've resisted looking at, that I've pushed down and turned my attention from. And so a couple of years ago, some of that finally caught up with me. Some of that worked its way up to the surface and pretty much knocked me on my ass. And it was of such an intensity that I'm still recovering from it. In some ways, it's been this continuous clearing where more and more is being brought up to the surface over time. And just when I'm beginning to think that I've got it all worked out or that I'm coming to the end of it, something else comes up. Something gets uncovered or triggered or pushed up to the surface. And sometimes it can be really overwhelming. It can be really exhausting at times, but it's what I signed up for. that's the thing, when I took up this path, when I decided that I want to focus on growth and awakening, well, what that entails is that we face our own darkness, our own illusions, our own suffering, that we face all of that in order to transform or transmute it. And the only way out is through. So if you sincerely want to grow, life is going to give you every opportunity, and it's not always going to be pleasant. In fact, much of what is required for our growth can be deeply uncomfortable and sometimes very painful. The lessons tend to show up in ways that really challenge us, that push and poke and provoke us, that shake us in order to wake us up. But if we're really receptive to it, if we can learn to embrace it instead of turning away from it, it can be profoundly transformative, and it can transform us in ways that we may not have even anticipated. Suffering can teach us all sorts of things. It can show us where we have some unhealthy attachment or expectation. It can show us where we're holding to some false or limiting belief, or some deep emotional wound that needs healing. Or maybe provoking us to discover some hidden strength, some virtue, or even our own sense of worth. One thing that suffering has done for me is to make me more sensitive to the suffering of others, to help me better understand the suffering of others, and to deepen my empathy. And not that I didn't have empathy before, it's just that there have been times when I might have been dismissive of other people's suffering, that there were some situations or experience in which, not having experienced that sort of thing for myself, I didn't really understand the depth of the suffering that they were experiencing. And so I might have dismissed it as being overly exaggerated, that the person is just being melodramatic, making a big deal out of something very small, or that they just need to let it go and move on. In other words, there were times when I was lacking in compassion. Sometimes what a person needs more than anything is just a little compassion. Just to feel heard and seen and loved. Just to feel understood. Sometimes part of the process is just to sit with our suffering and to rest in it. Not to do anything to try and fix it, not to be in a rush to get rid of it, but just to allow it to be there and to be present with it, to let it run its own course. But when I would see someone suffering like that, I would think, they just need to get over it. They just need to move on. And I might offer some advice that seemed very logical or rational, but wasn't really very helpful, because what they really needed in that moment was just some compassion. I think probably one of the most important things that our suffering can do for us is to help us cultivate more compassion for others. Sometimes we can be so wrapped up in our own suffering that we forget that other people are also suffering. Or it may be that we just ignore their suffering or simply diminish it because it isn't ours. We tend to think that our own suffering is much more important or even worse than the suffering of others because we're experiencing it directly, because it directly affects us. But something that really shifted for me is that when I'm suffering, I begin to think about the suffering of others. I know that there must be others who are suffering in a very similar way, who are also experiencing something similar to what I'm currently experiencing, and perhaps much worse. And so my heart goes out to them. Being in the midst of my own suffering, I find that I'm more able to understand the suffering of others, to be more empathetic. And from that, compassion arises. I'm no longer confined by my own suffering. I'm not alone in it. It doesn't have to cut me off from the rest of humanity, but rather I recognize that what I'm experiencing is part of a shared human experience, and that connects me to the rest of humanity. And the more that I feel compassion for the suffering of others, the less I find myself overwhelmed by my own suffering, the less I find myself disconnected, isolated, and alone. The thing about compassion is that it's essentially arising out of love. And love is really about connectedness. It connects us to one another, or rather it reveals that underlying connectedness, which is always there, but which we tend to overlook. And in that there is something which alleviates our suffering, or at the very least reduces it. Because when we're in a space of love, there's a certain loss of self. The boundaries between self and other begin to dissolve. And so much of our suffering is dependent upon the sense of being separated from others, being isolated, being alone in our suffering. So this is something that we can practice whenever we're experiencing any suffering, to recognize that we're not alone in that experience, to recognize that others are also suffering, and that our own experience of that can help us to better understand the suffering of others, to better empathize with the suffering of others, and to extend ourselves through compassion. And when we begin to extend beyond ourselves, beyond that barrier, by extending compassion to others, our own suffering decreases.